G'day and thanks for joining me for week 2 of our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. This week we're going to finish off the book of Job, reading from chapters 17 through to 42. Until then, sit back and enjoy today's tutorial.
Now, as I said last week, the book of Job, the reason we're reading it now is because it seems to be set in the time period of the early chapters of Genesis, okay, the age of the ancients, possibly even the age of Abraham, but around that kind of era. So that's why we're reading the story now, based there in what we call the ancient Near East. The reason it's found in the middle of our Bible is because of the genre of literature that it is. And that's what I'm going to be speaking most about today in the next few minutes. The genre of literature and when the book was written. It seems most likely by the style of how it's written and by some of the theology that comes out of it, that it was actually written in the era from Solomon and beyond. It's between Solomon and the exile. People, we're not 100% sure of that because we don't really even know who the author is. The author doesn't identify himself. Some believe that the author could even be King Solomon himself. Okay, so the same guy that wrote Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and Song of Songs, maybe this book of Job was one of his many things apparently that he was credited with writing. We just don't know. But the point is, it was written in that part of history, but it was written about a period of time around the time of Abraham or before. Now, let me speak about the genre. When we're reading the book of Job this week and last week, we are reading a book of poetry. It is a masterpiece, apparently, for those who read Hebrew. I don't, right? But it is a masterpiece of Hebrew poetry. And you can see that it's set out like that. I mean, the start, it begins with a prologue about Job and his family and his wealth and how God and Satan are apparently talking together, right? I'll talk about that in a moment. It starts with a prologue. It finishes with a beautiful epilogue that just sort of caps off the story, these two bookends. And in between, we've got these long speeches between, so far, Job and his 3 friends, and soon this week we'll be introduced to a 4th friend, a guy called Elihu. And they're doing these massive monologues to one another, and they are written as poetry. That's why, for most of us in our Bible, the font, the editors set the font into the page, because it's not written as narrative or as like a history book would be written, all right? It's all poetry. It's written as prose. So that whole thing is sort of set in to communicate that to you. So it's kind of like reading an ancient book of Hebrew Shakespeare. You know, it's like this big bit of poetry. It's kind of written, in my mind, it seems it's like a play where you've got these major characters on the stage doing monologues to one another, and they are telling the story. And that's a real interesting point to make and a place to have your mind attentive to when you read this book. My point in these videos is not to give devotional reflections for you. My point in these videos is not to even dissect the theology or to highlight the theology of what you're going to be reading. You're an adult, read the book yourself and get stuff out of it. My job in these videos is to help you understand the genre, help you to approach this book, or every book, in an intelligent way, understanding how it fits in the big picture. And when you approach the book of Job, this is what you need to know. It is a play. It is written as a piece of poetry. So it is highly likely that what we are reading is not an historical, factual story. It's one big parable. It's a fictional story. The book of Job and his friends doing these big monologues. I mean, people don't talk like that in real life, right? These big monologues to one another. This is written as a Hebrew piece of poetry, like one big parable. Now, I'm not saying Job wasn't a historical person. He might have been. I mean, Ezekiel mentions him. The book of James, I think it's chapter 5, mention him as a good example. But that doesn't mean he was a literal historical figure. That doesn't mean Job was really a real-life man. I mean, he's not mentioned in any of the genealogies. You've got this significant figure that has this massive book devoted to him, and you'll never see his name in any genealogy. So he could very well be an entirely made-up figure. And you can Google stuff like this. People debate this and argue this. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because the point is you can still take the story seriously without taking it literally. You can take it seriously without taking it literally, like Jesus' parables. You know, when Jesus, in Luke 15, says, there was a man who had two sons, and he tells a story of the prodigal son, right? When he says there was a man that had two sons, was there a man that had two sons? Was that a real historical story? Or was Jesus telling a parable? Was he making up a story in order to teach a lesson, in order to make a point? Now, of course, 99% of Christians, when you talk about the prodigal son story, will say, oh, it's a parable. It's the parable of the prodigal son. But go read Luke 15. Jesus doesn't call it a parable, and Luke doesn't call it a parable. You have assumed it's a parable. But you've done so on very good grounds, because it reads like a parable. It has the feel of a parable to it. You can kind of tell. Jesus doesn't have to say, or Luke doesn't have to say, then Jesus told this parable. It's kind of obvious, okay, that the prodigal son story is a parable that highly likely Jesus made up. Now, if you believe the prodigal son story is a true historical event, that there really was someone, on the front page of the newspaper that week that had that story, and Jesus was kind of retelling a real life story. If you believe that, I don't care, whatever, but the prodigal son story is highly likely a made-up parable that Jesus invented to make a point. And the same is true with the book of Job. It's a made-up parable, it's a made-up story of fiction that Solomon or someone else has created. They've written this play, this piece of poetry, in order to make a point. And that doesn't make it any less true, okay? It doesn't make it any less scripture. You can still, like the prodigal son story, you can still take it very seriously and get the author's intent, the author's message, without having to take it literally. We don't have to do that. That whole thing is a very Western Greek way of thinking. This is a book of Hebrew poetry, and if you believe it's a parable, if you believe it's real life, that's up to you. I don't really care. I'm just saying the way that it's written lends many people to believe that it is a parable, okay? It's one big parable in order to communicate a point. And when you understand that, it helps you to be very careful and cautious. It helps you to be aware, okay, of some of the conclusions that you might make when reading it. You see, the nature of a parable is to set a picture. It's to paint a big picture story, to draw people into a narrative, to draw people into a story so that the storyteller can make one or two big points. So Jesus did that with the parable of the prodigal son. He tells this story, he paints this picture so at the end he can make the point about the big brother, being the first century Jewish people. Or you can make a point about the younger brother, being the Gentiles that are coming in and God's celebrating them. So the whole picture around the pigs and the prostitutes and the parties and the claiming his inheritance and all that, we're not meant to read too much into those details. That's just there to paint the picture to draw people in. And it's the same with the book of Job. It's a big parable. That means that when you read, I'm saying that all that to say this, when you read something like the introduction, where it talks about God and Satan having a little chit-chat, okay, about Job. Satan rocks up to God's house, for a cup of tea, and they're just talking about, and God says, oh, Job's a good bloke, why don't you have a go at him? Why don't you give him hell for a while? You read that and you think, what the heck? Listen, that relationship between God and Satan, of God giving permission, of God just saying, oh yeah, Satan, have a go at one of my guys for me, just give him hell for a week. That relationship between God and Satan is not described like that anywhere in the Bible, okay? And I believe the reason for that is this: it doesn't exist. That is not a true account of God and Satan relating. That is just the way the author is setting up the story to draw people in to make his main point. So when you read a parable, when you read a parabolic story, you're not meant to take every detail literally, and you're certainly not meant to build theology or come to theological or doctrinal conclusions based on the surrounding narrative that sets up the story. So if you've started Job this week and you've seen, Satan approaching God and God inviting him to have a go at someone, if you thought, well, wow, I wonder if God will do that to me one day. I wonder if God will just say, Satan, why don't you have a go at Chad this week? Give him hell, You put your worst out upon him. Listen, that is not going to happen. That is not real. Okay? It's recorded in Scripture, but it's not real. It is a parable designed to set up the story. You're not meant to take every detail literally, to still take the parable seriously and learn the main lesson. And the main lesson of the book of Job is this. Come back next week. No, I'm kidding. The main lesson of the book of Job is this. Who are you listening to? Job is going through a hard time, and it's not his fault. There's a life lesson that everyone can identify with. Suffering, going through agony, going through pain, going through struggle, and it not being your fault. Almost anyone can identify with that. And anyone can also identify with the fact that when you're going through a hard time, sometimes you have friends that come to you to give you advice. And sometimes their advice is helpful, and sometimes their advice is not helpful. And that's the story you are reading. You are reading a big parable that is designed to encourage us. It's a book of wisdom, remember, that is designed to encourage us to incline our ears to the right people. You are going to read a lot of stuff this week that is spoken by these friends of Job, these 3 friends, and then Elihu is the 4th friend. You're going to read a lot of stuff this week that is, some of it is good advice and some of it is not good advice. That's why you always need to be careful of who is speaking when you read the scripture. You can't open the book of Job and just put your finger down and think that what you're about to read is God speaking. It's not. The scripture is being recorded by God. All scripture is God-breathed and is here for a purpose. But some of the words you read this week in Job are going to be false. It's going to be bad advice. And we see that at the end of the story. When God says to Job, or God says to the 3 friends, there's a bunch of stuff that you guys have told Job in all these chapters that was wrong. And the reason it was wrong is because you don't know me properly. So be careful. As you read the book of Job this week, don't come to significant theological conclusions and don't think that everything that you are reading is good advice. You'll find out at the end of the story that some of it was not good advice. Bless you guys. Have an awesome week and really trust that you enjoyed Job. And the next week, of course, we'll get back into Genesis. Bye!
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.